Doing.
Good morning, everybody. We are starting the second lesson in the book of selections from Likutei Sichos on page 646. I am going to give a very short, brief introduction so that we can follow well. This week's portion, Vaychi, among other stories, we read about Yaakov's last few days on earth in his body. And Yosef brings his two sons, Menashe and Ephraim, to his father to bless them before he dies. Yaakov begins by saying, Ephraim u'Menashe Reuven veShimon hiyu li. Those two sons, Ephraim and Menashe, I consider like my other children who were born to me for my wives, Reuven and Shimon, the first two sons. And then after blessing Yosef and requesting to be buried in Shechem, in what's the town that's known today as an Arab town called Nablus, he is asking to bless Yosef brings the two sons so Yaakov can put his hands over them and bless them.
What is this about Shechem? I thought the Machpelah.
That's Yaakov, but he's gifting Yosef that town. He's offering it to him as a gift. Right. But instead of placing his head, so Yosef puts the one child, who is the oldest? Menashe. He puts him to the right side, the left of Yosef, which is the right side of Yaakov. And Ephraim, who is the younger, is put to the left. Yaakov was blind, he couldn't see, but he was switching his hands, and that's how he blesses them, so to say, placing the right hand over Ephraim's head, and the left hand over Menashe was the firstborn. Yosef turned to his father and says, you need to change. It should be Menashe first. Menashe is the oldest. And Yaakov says, I know exactly what I'm doing. Menashe is the firstborn, but Ephraim deserves greater blessings because he will reach out much farther than Menashe. There are many questions that can be asked. One is that the Rabbi was going to be asking, as we'll discover here. So I start by reading the text, summarizing, and sometimes I will skip text so we can complete the whole point. This week's Torah reading relates that when Yosef presented his two sons, Ephraim and Menashe, before Yaakov for him to bless them, Yaakov placed his right hand on Ephraim and his left on Menashe. When Yosef saw this, it displeased him. Yosef told his father, no, father, this one, Menashe, is the firstborn. Place your right hand on his head. So when Yosef saw that Yaakov is placing the right hand on Ephraim and the left on Menashe, he says, Dad, this is not the right way. You should put your right hand on Menashe and don't switch the hands. Yaakov answered him, I know, my son, I know. He will also become great. Yet his younger brother will become greater than he. And he placed Ephraim before Menashe. Explanation is necessary. The Rabbi is asking, by the way, this discussion is Kabbalah. And the last part of this is really Kabbalah, deep Kabbalah, which I don't know that we'll get to. The reason a firstborn is deserving of receiving a greater blessing than all the other children is that he possesses an inherent advantage over them and greater prominence. Since Ephraim's level surpassed Menashe's, his younger brother will become greater than he. Why was it ordained from above that Menashe would be the firstborn and not Ephraim? The Rabbi is asking a simple question. Jewish law tells us that always the firstborn is greater than the other children. I'm a firstborn. My wife is a firstborn. My father is a firstborn. So we all get in the inheritance, in ancient time, they will get double portion. They also consider the essence of their parents. As we see that Yaakov blesses Reuven as you are the beginning of my essence, all my essence and the beginning of my strength. So if Ephraim is going to have greater achievements, his descendants will have greater achievements, why did God ordain that Ephraim be born second? He should have been born first to resolve the conflict between Yaakov and Yosef. In other words, God knows the future. Yaakov is talking about the future, not now. If he's talking about the future and Ephraim is greater, make him be born first, and then Menashe should be born. Is the fact that Menashe was nevertheless the firstborn leads to the conclusion that although his younger brother would become greater than he, Menashe possessed an advantage over Ephraim, and accordingly, he was Joseph's firstborn. However, with regards to Yaakov's blessing, the quality in which Ephraim surpassed Menashe deserved emphasis. Therefore, in this context, he placed Ephraim before Menashe. Therefore, says the Rabbi, it must be that Menashe is always greater than Ephraim. Only with regards to Yaakov's blessings, Ephraim takes precedence, takes priority. But it's not necessarily that Ephraim is greater than Menashe. Otherwise, Ephraim should have been born first.
But these were grandchildren.
Right.
So therefore, it didn't really matter about the inheritance, because the inheritance is really going to come from Yosef.
But if Yaakov is making Ephraim the greatest, greater than Menashe, by blessing them in a way that Ephraim gets the greater of blessing, then let them be born to Yosef in that order. The fact that they were not born in that order, it means that for Yosef, from Yosef's point of view, as his children, Menashe is greater. And just in the context of this blessing of Yaakov, Ephraim has one quality that surpasses that of Menashe, and therefore it changes. So therefore, you cannot have Ephraim be born first, because Menashe is greater than Ephraim. Just in this case, in this particular situation, Ephraim comes first.
But it must be so significant that we still bless our children, Ephraim and
Right. I have another question nobody is bothered by here, and that is, Yosef is bothered when he places his hands like that. But Yosef is not bothered when Yaakov tells him, Ephraim Menashe Reuven v'Shimon Yuli. He gives him a speech earlier where he puts Ephraim before Menashe, and he tells him it's like Reuven and Shimon. Reuven is before Shimon, right? So he already told him, he didn't hint. He says to him, you two sons that were born to you before I came here, Ephraim and Menashe, are like Reuven and Shimon. He already placed priority over Ephraim before Menashe. Yosef is not bothered. He doesn't say to his father, well, you should say Menashe and Ephraim like Reuven and Shimon. If you say Ephraim and Menashe, say Shimon and Reuven. But yet, only when he places his hands. We'll see what the Rabbi has to say about that. So again, says the Rabbi, the fact that Menashe was born first means that Menashe is greater than Ephraim. However, when Yaakov is blessing them, there is a certain quality, a particular detail of the life of those two, the future life of those two, that Ephraim deserved to be greater than Menashe. And that's why only in this regard is placing the right hand of Ephraim and the left hand of Menashe. There is another concept involved. As mentioned many times, it is not appropriate to say that tzaddikim, and surely not the patriarchs or Yaakov's sons, commit mistakes in a simple sense. Every time you read in the Torah that they sold him as a slave, or they slept with someone and they did inappropriately behavior, it is just the way that we see it for someone who reads simple English and reads a novel and reads a romance, and then they read the Torah and they see a problem, they see something that's an issue, but it's not true. Everything is very appropriate and holy. And to explain that in a simple way, imagine you have two women who say, oh, thank God my son started talking. What does that mean? Is that great? Is that a blessing or not? Why are you laughing?
That's a blessing for the first couple of years.
If the person speaking is 23 years old, you listening assume that she's talking about a 1-year-old baby that's thank God he started talking. But if it's an 85 years old person who says, finally my son is talking, it can be interpreted in many ways. One is that unfortunately he had a deficiency and he didn't speak until today. that child, who is probably much older than a year old, is in his 30s or 40s, and thank God he started speaking. So it's not a great blessing, it's a misfortune. Also, it can be a criminal who started speaking at the police interrogation. So he started opening up his mouth. You can talk about someone, my son started speaking, meaning a speaking engagement in public. He became a public speaker. There can be many interpretations to the words, my son finally started speaking. And when I connect that, I connected the way I see what speaking is, or the age of the person I see, but it's not necessarily the truth. So when you see, this is an example I just heard recently. This is an example to the Torah. When you read about sins or misbehaving, don't be fooled. It's not a 23 years old who speaks about a year-and-a-half-old son. It's a much different situation. And once you delve into the details, you find out that it's all a very holy activity. We will see an example, a sample of that in this discussion. So says the Rabbi, we know that everything that appears in the Torah, nobody makes mistakes. The people of the Torah, our patriarchs, the tribes, did not commit sins in the simple sense that we understand sins. And therefore, in particular, this applies with regards to matters that were recorded in the Torah of truth. Says the Rebbe, if the Torah recorded it, it must be because the Torah wants to teach us something, and it cannot be something negative. Certainly, such matters represent eternal truth, since the word Torah is related to the word Ora'ah, meaning instruction. These matters also serve as eternal lessons for every Jew in all generations. So everything you read in the Torah, even if it's a very negative, devastating story, it must be a lesson for me, and the lesson must be a positive lesson. Therefore, the story must be a very good, positive story. From this, it can be understood that Yosef did not state, this one is the firstborn, place your right hand on Menashe's head, because he erred and did not realize that his younger brother will become greater than he. Rather, he maintained that the advantage Menashe possessed as manifest in his being the firstborn, as stated above, outweighed the advantage Ephraim would achieve. Says the Rebbe, when Yosef turned to Yaakov, to his father, he says, hey, he's not the oldest. Menashe is the oldest. Change. It's not that he made a mistake when Yaakov says, I know, don't worry. It means that they had a different views of looking at the advantage of Ephraim versus Menashe, where Yosef saw Menashe's advantage as a firstborn in all aspects, including the aspects of the blessings, that we'll discuss it soon. And Yaakov, on the other hand, did not agree with him. But did not agree didn't mean that someone makes a mistake. It's just a different viewpoint from a different personality, as the Rabbi will explain. Thus, both concepts, Yosef's impression that Menashe's inherent advantage was higher, and Yaakov's understanding that Ephraim would reach a loftier rank, are true. From the standpoint of Yosef's attributes, the divine service, Menashe deserved prominence, while from the standpoint of Yaakov's attribute and divine service, Ephraim was deemed worthier. So there is no conflict. There is nobody who's making a mistake. It's just they have different viewpoints, and each one, from their viewpoint, sees advantage in one of the sons. Yosef sees Menashe, Yaakov sees Ephraim. So there are 2 points. First, the Rabbi says, the fact that the Menashe was born first, it means that Ephraim is greater than Menashe only with regards to the blessing of Yaakov, not everything else. Second, the fact that Yosef is telling his father to change around, it's not because he's telling his father that he made a mistake, and his father was correcting him. He's not correcting him because he made a mistake. It's just they had a disagreement about who is greater, and each one came from a different point of view, and therefore each one saw the greatness of another one. Yosef saw Menashe, Yaakov saw Ephraim.
But Yaakov's vision is different than Yosef's vision.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, this is really the difference.
That's the point, right?
Well,
In other words, no one is mistaken here. Both have a place depending from what vantage point, from what direction you're looking at it, as we'll discover.
Joseph doesn't have the vision of the future that Yaakov has.
He does,
He does?
Sure.
He does as well. So he has the same vision of the future.
right,
They're equal in that regard. So
right, right, 100%.
When.
We'll see it in a
when
moment.
Joseph is gonna die.
Yeah, later on.
Who's he gonna bless as his firstborn?
Menashe,
Yeah.
as
right.
we'll find out, yes,
So Menashe will actually get the double inheritance.
right. That's correct.
Okay, that's what.
Menashe was a firstborn, and the Rabbi is
Yeah.
pointing out that if Ephraim was greater than Menashe, he would have been born first. The fact that he wasn't, it means that Menashe is greater. It just with regards to the dimension, one aspect called the blessings of Yaakov. Ephraim, Yaakov felt that Ephraim came first. Yosef, even in that regard, felt that Menashe come first, and as we'll see where they came from. It's all about us, by the way. We'll see how it applies to us in our day-to-day life.
It's not the same outcome as Jacob and Esau, right? This is just
No.
a blessing like
Totally different.
not just for the first one.
But well, okay, do we actually see Joseph blessing Menashe and Ephraim?
No,
Okay.
no, we don't see it.
I didn't think so.
Did Joseph have any more children?
What's important about these blessings is that Yaakov considers those two sons equal to the tribes. And
Understand.
then in
Well, that's why we have
land,
Menashe, not Joseph.
in the land of Israel, Yosef received double portion. Yosef became the firstborn when it comes to the real estate, the estate.
Right.
And therefore Menashe got a portion, Ephraim got a portion. So in the tribes in Israel, there is no section. There is a section for Dan, Gad, Reuven. There is no section for Yosef. There's Menashe and there is Ephraim. Menashe, by the way, did not take in the Holy Land, takes across the Jordan outside, but Ephraim did. So you have two. Therefore, it's important for Yaakov to bless them now to show that they are considered like his children, because later on he's blessing all the sons. He does not bless the two
So by doing
sons.
this, what he really did was give Joseph a double portion.
He appointed them as firstborn, right?
Yeah.
And it appears from different directions in this week's portion, by the way.
But did Reuben was firstborn?
Reuven was firstborn, but he lost it. He lost three gifts: kingdom, priesthood, and inheritance.
Because of what happened.
Priesthood was given to Levi, kingdom was given to Judah, and inheritance was given to Joseph. Because of mixing up the beds. When Rachel died, he took the bed of Yaakov and he moved it to Leah instead of being in Bilhah, the maidservant of Rachel. And Yaakov was, this is an enormous scene because I'm giving you the gist of it. There will be more questions arise, so I don't want to address the questions. Yaakov in his tent, how did he know which tent to sleep in? He had an additional bed in each one of the four tents, the four mothers, Rachel, Leah, Bilhah, and Zilpah. There was an extra bed for God, for godliness. And every night you would go in and you would see where God is resting, which bed. He was a holy man, and God was resting together with him and his wife. And at that time, when Rachel died, he saw God's divine spirit resting in Bilhah, the servant, the maid of Rachel. Reuven says, my mother, I don't want, my mother suffered from her sister, now she's going to suffer from the sister's maid. So he moved the bed. Yaakov told them it's called Chilul Hashem, desecration of godliness, and for that there is no atonement. Reuven, by the way, atoned there in his entire life. Many years. He wore sackcloth and he was fasting. We read about the selling of Yosef. He wasn't there. Where did he go? He continued to pray and ask for forgiveness. Yaakov tells them, you know, you became a firstborn through still theft. Your holy grandfather, Laban, mixed Leah and Rachel, right? You're familiar with that? Yeah. So my firstborn was supposed to be Yosef, not Reuven, because I really wanted to marry Rachel. How did you become our firstborn? Through theft, through your grandfather stealing. You continued with the same behavior by stealing my bed and moving it from where it should have been and moved it into your mother's tent. By doing so, you lost the firstborn right. So it's going to go back to the original place where it belonged, to Yosef, who was the firstborn of Rachel. I hope you understand what I said. It's totally out of context for the discussion, but it's just an important point because it will solve a lot of questions. Let's continue.
Seems like if Yaakov could have opened his eyes a couple of times, he could have saved a lot of aggravation.
He's so better than all of us see 2020. What's-
Well, I mean, first Leah, he couldn't.
It was God's ordained, please.
Now
That's what we
you know,
just said.
it's-
Nothing is.
He should open his eyes.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Basically, even if you see it,
Yeah.
it doesn't work.
Okay.
Thus we see that with regard to Joseph's fathering his two sons, Menashe was the firstborn, and the power of his father was manifest in him more than in Joseph's other son. With regard to the relationship to Yaakov, by contrast, the order is, the two sons born to you are mine. I will consider Ephraim and Menashe as Reuben and Shimon. In this statement, Ephraim is placed before Menashe and compared to Reuben, Yaakov's firstborn. Did you understand? So therefore, the fact that Yosef is trying to correct and Yaakov says, no, you made a mistake. I know what I'm doing. Yosef is not making a mistake. Menashe is the firstborn because he's greater than Ephraim and he comes before Ephraim. However, when it comes to the blessings, Yaakov felt that from his point of view, what he represents, Ephraim is greater. Yosef, what he represents, Menashe comes first, even when it comes to the blessings. Now the Rabbi is going to address and explains that. The difference between Menashe and Ephraim, also the advantage each of them possessed, and the reason Menashe's advantage shared a closer connection to Yosef, while Ephraim shared a closer advantage to Yaakov's blessing, can be understood through an analysis of the difference between their names. The Rabbi says, you want to know why is this, that Yosef is connected to Menashe and Ephraim, and Yaakov, when it comes to blessings, is connected to Ephraim? Look to their names, and their names will tell you a lot about them. Yosef named his older son Menashe, and he says, the Torah tells us why is he named Menashe? Because God made me forget. Nashani. Nashani in Hebrew means forget. All my struggle and all my father's home. While he named his younger son Ephraim, because God has made me fruitful, Ifrani, in the land of my oppression. Both names thus express the feeling which the descent to Egypt evoked within Yosef, but each communicates an opposite thrust. The Rabbi says, look at the names. Menashe means God made me not forget about my father's house. In other words, I continued the tradition of my father from where I came from. Egypt is a very modern place. My father's house is very traditional, has certain real behavior, conduct, and I stick to them. That's Menashe. Ephraim, God made me fruitful and made me expand and become greater in a land of Egypt. That's what the names mean in when he named them. That's a Torah, what the Torah says. Says the Rabbi, the name Menashe reminded Yosef that he was made to forget his father's house. That is, he realized that he was living in a place which made him spring away and forget his father's home. This name expresses his yearning not to forget, and on the contrary, to remain connected with his father's home. The name Ephraim, by contrast, reflects praise and thanksgiving for making me fruitful in the land of my oppression, focusing on the virtues achieved by Yosef in Egypt. Says the Rabbi, Menashe is about yearning to the past, my parents, my family back there in the old home, and constantly reminding himself about where he came from. Ephraim is about when I'm set root and I put an anchor here and I expand. That's great, and I thank God for that. These two concepts reflect two general thrusts in the Jews' divine service in the land of their oppressions in exile. Says the Rebbe, those two names represent our connection to God during the time where we are in Egypt, in exile. One mode of divine service emphasizes laboring not to be affected by one's surrounding environment. This is achieved by remaining in touch with one's father's home, the person's situation prior to exile. The person continually reminds himself that he is living in a situation which makes him forget his father's home, and these efforts prevent him from forgetting. In other words, there is one way when we go to exile, when we move out of the shtetl, we came out from lands or from our holy land into exile. One way to keep stuck with our tradition is to constantly remind ourselves where I came from. I have an old Kiddush cup from my great-grandfather. I have an outfit or a plate that came from my Bobby, and that reminds me of my home. A language, certain words in Yiddish or Ladino, whatever the language is, that keeps me not forget about my past. Now, if I don't forget about my past, it keeps me with the boundaries, not to cross those boundaries and to be like everybody else, disobeying God and disgracing God. That's one way a person can hold himself back from falling while they are in exile. The second mode emphasizes how the person and his divine service focus on working within and transforming the land of my oppression, confronting the darkness of exile. Such a person is not to the same degree concerned with remembering his father's home. Instead, he labors to illuminate the darkness of the exile with the light of holiness. Doing so also elevates and engenders positive virtues within the person himself, and through these efforts, the person becomes fruitful, specifically in the land of his oppression. Rabbi says there is another way of looking at it, and that represented by Ephraim. Forget about your past. Forget about your grandparents. Make sure that you are connecting with the surrounding and social environment, and make everybody follow you behavior, follow the right behavior. While you embark in doing positive, no negativity can connect to you. So one way is just to close myself and remember constantly my past and be worried what are other people influencing me, other media, etc. That's the first one. The second one is spring forth. Forget about my past. Forget about the strings that you attach to your past. Forget about them. Just make sure that you're so strong about your values that you impact and influence your surrounding, that they change also. Once you're involved in changing your surrounding, no one will touch you or your family and bring to them not blessings. This is the Rabbi is going to get into greater details. The reason Ephraim's achievement is considered greater than Menashe's is that the ultimate purpose of the descent to Egypt, and in a larger sense, the descent into all the exiles, is that they are descents for the sake of ascent, that is, springboards enabling the Jewish people to reach a position above the level that preceded the descent. Such an ascent is achieved not only by not forgetting one's father's home, but also and primarily by making a change within the environment of the exile, transforming the descent into exile to a positive influence, being fruitful in the land of my oppression. Says the Rabbi, when God sent us to exile, he sent us for something to beneficial. You cannot come into exile and come out the same way. It's like going to the market, you buy something for 20 cents and you sell it for 20 cents. All day long, you're busy buying and selling, but you don't make a living. So if I am remaining steadfast with my tradition and keep my family with the tradition, if that's the purpose, because I always remember my past, what happens is I didn't gain anything by going to exile. God could have kept me away from exile. The reason God sends us to exile is he wants us to convert exile, to influence others who are in the darkness, so to say, spiritual darkness, and enlighten them and bring them closer. That's Ephraim. Ephraim goes out, is an outwards behavior. Instead of focusing on the past, looking at the brighter future of changing exile, bringing exile to a higher state. That's the goal. And that's why Yaakov says in the future, when we talk about living in Egypt, if I know Menashe is great, because as we'll discover, without Menashe, you cannot have anything. Without the past, you can't have anything. But the real focus, the real emphasis should be for Ephraim. to expand where you are, to influence your surrounding, and by doing so, you're guaranteed to remain steadfast in your tradition, and in addition, you're gaining something by being in exile. All the efforts and the hardship in exile is for a cause, for a real reason, because you're changing exile. We will see soon, the Rabbi will address how come Yosef disagree with Yaakov, but we didn't get there yet. So hold your horses. Nevertheless, Menashe is still the firstborn. Why? Regarding birth, which relates to the quality of revelation, that is, divine service is revealed, revealed, active sense, Menashe must proceed a fine. Before a person can positively impact the land of my oppression, that is, follow the mode of doing good, he must first ensure that he will not be affected by the darkness of exile, and must first follow the mode of turning away from evil by continually remembering and thus remaining in contact with his father's home. So says the Rabbi, in order for us to get to the level of Ephraim, to expand and reach out and change the exile, you must have your own energy, you must have your own background, you must have your own solid values, and they are what Menashe is about. I bring it from my father's house and bring it from the tradition, and not creating my own tradition, because that will not last. Only when it comes from the past, then I can create the end goal, which is to expand and change the environment. That's why Menashe had to be born first. However, since the ultimate intent of the descent into Egypt is the subsequent ascent, the goal of going to exile is not to remain with my values and to remain connected to God, but to influence my surrounding and make the darkness into light. Therefore, Ephraim is given prominence in Yaakov's blessings. Yaakov's blessing endowed the Jews with power from above for divine service during the exile. Ephraim's service reflected the ultimate purpose of the exile, and therefore, Yaakov placed Ephraim before Menashe. Now the Rabbi is going to get one step farther. By the way, after this, one step deeper. Once we go this deep, we can go 2 more levels the Rabbi is going to talk about, which we're not going to get to. Now the Rabbi says to us, now we understand in general the difference between Menashe and Ephraim. Now we understand why Yaakov put Ephraim before, because they were born in Egypt, and that represents exile. And when a child, a Jewish soul, is in exile, they have to have the background from the father's home, but the ultimate goal is to expand, go out and change darkness into light, influence others to be a positive persons, and that reflects in the name of Ephraim. That's why Ephraim is the highest priority. Now the Rabbi says, let's go a little bit farther, a little bit deeper. A deeper explanation of the above. There are several dimensions to the positive virtue and the higher quality which a Jew achieves through the service in the darkness of exile. When we say that we are in exile and we remain connected to God and we follow the value that God gave us, keeping kosher, being kind to one another, not cheating, not lying, keeping Shabbat, we do it amidst a universe that is totally against those values. There are several levels and several ways to interpret it. A, just as an adversary calls forth a person's inner drive for victory, descent brings out the soul's tenacity, showing that it is not influenced by the darkness of exile. In other words, when I am faced with neighbors and community which advocates different lifestyle, marriage, which advocates sometimes lying, cheating, advocates all kinds of misbehaving, and I stick to the rules, and I shake only men's hands, no women's hands, and I'm advocating for marriage between male and female, and I am telling people that without marriage there should not be any sexual relationship, which is against the politically correct statements. That helps me, just like when you want to jump forward, you take a step back. The darkness is the bounce wall that allows me to bounce back and strengthen my values. That's one way looking at exile. In a similar vein, the Baal Shem Tov interprets the verse, "My soul thirsts for you because I am in a parched land, so may I see you in the sanctuary," as a plea. If only that the intense desire for godliness a person feels when distant from God will be sustained after the person comes close to him again. I'm just gonna, this point is illuminated in a very beautiful way. When people came out of Russia, in Russia, where the communist regime was fighting Judaism, they would sacrifice their life to connect, to go to synagogue and Simchat Torah, to study Hebrew, to sing Jewish songs. They lost their jobs. Many of them were taken away from colleges. They were not allowed to, they were fired from their jobs, but they did it with great pride. What happens when they move to the land of democracy, Vienna, Germany, Israel? They let go of it because nothing is forcing them against their identity. So sometimes darkness and adversary actually pushes you to bring forth all your positivity. So that's one way looking at darkness. The purpose of darkness is to live there, and then my yearning for God is far greater than when I'm close to God. And that's what King David says. The Baal Shem Tov says that King David is praising, is begging God that his yearning towards God should be the same as it was when he was farther from God. In the same way it should be when he's closer to God, because when you're close to God, there is no big, it's not a big deal, we don't get excited. But when you're farther from God, that's when you have all the excitements. B, an even more profound purpose is achieved by the soul's descent. The radical descent calls forth the deeper, unbounded inner powers of the soul that the soul possesses. These powers enables the soul not only to remain whole and unblemished, that his exile does not bring about a descent in the person's spiritual level, but on the contrary, the person influences his surroundings and elevates them to his level, transforming the darkness of the exile into light. So there is another level. Going to darkness, to a place of darkness where there is no godliness, is exile, is for the purpose of changing other people, taking dark and turning a light in them. So when I go out and I live in a place where my surroundings are very negative and they are against God's values, and I convince them, and one at a time I make them connect to God, what I did was I turned darkness into light. So now it's a much greater. The first one is my own benefit. My connection to God is far greater, far deeper, with more sacrifice than when I'm in exile, than when I'm not. Another one is I'm influencing my surrounding. Now my surrounding is affected. If I wasn't here, they wouldn't have connected to God. So I brought light into many, many souls. Says the Rabbi, these two achievements, however, reflect the soul's inherent virtues and positive qualities. Exile thus serves merely as catalyst, enabling these innate virtues to surface through the divine service. However, says the Rabbi, there is nevertheless a higher positive quality which the soul achieves through its divine service in exile, one that makes the exile itself positive contributory influence. And here is number 3, says the Rabbi. Through transforming the darkness of exile to light, the soul receives a positive quality which it does not inherently possess. To cite a parallel, a Baal Teshuvah possesses merits that come from the transformation of his sins into merits, a positive quality which a tzaddik who does not sin does not possess. Says the Rabbi, there is a much greater benefit. When I am going out in the darkness and I change darkness into light, I am gifted with a new connection to God that I never had before. In that way, I can only achieve it during exile, only in a place of darkness. And the parallel the Rabbi is saying for it is a Baal Teshuvah versus a penitent, someone who repents. The Torah tells us that someone who is very far from God and is distant from God is what caused him to repent. If he makes a very, very deep, true Teshuvah, repentance, the sins turn into positive, to mitzvot. So eating ham and violating Shabbat suddenly becomes a mitzvah. A tzaddik can never reach that level, go so deep to take defilement and the negativity and turn it, not just get rid of it, but making it positive. It's impossible. Torah tells us that a Baal Teshuvah can achieve that. In other words, when I'm in exile, and I am converting people to find the light and connect to God, not only I protect myself and the darkness helps me stay connected, not only I change my environment and bring more light into the surrounding of exile, now it's a third level. My soul attains such closeness to God or such relationship with God, a new channel of connection that I never possessed before, not even nowhere to be found. And it only can happen in darkness, only when we connect through darkness. Now the Rabbi says, the Rabbi will explain now the difference between Yosef, and the Rabbi is not, the Rabbi is going even further. I'm just going to summarize one more point. The Rabbi says that's the difference between Yosef and Yaakov. The real true level, the third level that we spoke about, turning the negativity and bringing new channel to connecting to God, can only be attained if we are getting to the deepest level of darkness. Just like committing a Baal Teshuvah that is seen turn into positive. Only the worst kind of behavior can turn into positive. Says the Rabbi, Yosef always represented his father. He was so connected to his father that almost there was no separation. Therefore, he felt in his level, he can only achieve the first two levels. The first one is to darkness keeps holding you back from sinning and connecting, or you're changing your surrounding, as Yosef did, 1 and 2. Yaakov, on the other hand, turned to Yosef and said, and that's why Yosef felt that Menashe comes first. Before you can influence his surrounding, you must be able to have your background. You must be holding back with your background. Yosef represents Yaakov in Egypt. But Yosef's two sons, who were born in Egypt, never saw their father, their grandfather, never connected to Yaakov, to the father's house. They were Egyptians. They were born in Egypt. The mother was Egyptian. They were part of society. They were, so to say, the deepest level of darkness in exile, representing the deepest aspect of darkness. Therefore, in order for us to attain a greater connection to God, a deeper connection to God that cannot be attained anywhere else, can only be achieved through sons of Yosef, not through Yosef himself. Because Yosef himself never ripped himself apart from his father's house. His father and him were so united that the memories remained with him forever. His children didn't have those memories because they never saw the grandfather. That's why the blessings Yaakov is giving is to Ephraim and Menashe, not to his own sons. And among them, says Yaakov to Yosef, if you want to attain a greater level of connection to God, in other words, not just to influence your surrounding as Ephraim, but reach deeper within yourself and connect to God to such a high level, it can be done only with those sons and only through Ephraim, not through Menashe, by connecting to the past. Because as soon as you connect to the past, you won't be able to reach much, much deeper. This is as far as we can go based on the time that we have. The Rabbi connects Yosef and Yaakov together and explains in spirituality what they mean, but we don't have the time. Thank you very much, everybody.